Now really grateful to introduce our Privacy Commissioner, John Edwards. He was appointed to the independent statutory position of Privacy Commissioner in 2014. He's currently serving his second 5-year term. He provides independent comment on significant personal information, policies and issues. John has practiced law in Wellington for over 20 years, specialising in information law while representing a wide range of public and private sector clients. He has acted in legal roles for the Ministry of Health, State Commission, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and Inland Revenue. His recent comments about Facebook in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings were reported extensively in New Zealand and around the world. Without further ado, John, please join us on the stage. We look forward to hearing from you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kei Marie, kia ora koutou katoa. It's a great pleasure to be here. The only downside of that notoriety is that if you Google the phrase morally bankrupt pathological liar, you see a whole lot of photographs of me. But it is timely that we are gathered to talk about identity and the importance of identity when over the weekend we had news of a significant breach involving identity documents, putting people in peril and undermining trust and confidence. So, I don't want to be cynical and say thank you to the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, but it just again underlies the importance of what we're here to talk about and to consider. And let us begin. Just to get a bit of perspective, this image has been very widely shared. It gives a glorious image of the universe and the Milky Way, and a little arrow pointing to the dot that is our solar system, and somewhere within that dot, our planet. It's offered as a comfort. You see how tiny we are, so are our problems. Well, maybe not so much for people who are embroiled in something, but if we can sort of withdraw a little and think about our disagreements in a celestial perspective, perhaps we can breathe a little easier. I say disagreements as if, some of the topics that we'll be talking about today are, awkward conversations at dinner parties. But actually some of these disagreements that we have about identity and deriving from identity can spiral into exclusion, insult, vitriol, and even violence. The concept of identity is central to this phenomenon. The dismissive epithet of identity politics actually provides us with a lens to understand many of the social stresses and tensions that have been exacerbated by digital technology. What Shoshana Zuboff, and I imagine there's a bingo card that everybody's going to take, every speaker has to mention surveillance capitalism. What Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, we might, for the purposes of today's conversation, reframe as the identity economy. Identity is at the core of some of the most defining trends, movements, and challenges we face today. Identity has been monetized by the digital industrialists and weaponized by populist political opportunists. In my brief chat today, I hope to examine the concept of identity in the context of these trends, identity politics and the identity economy. I want to think about assigned versus expressed identity and the role of social media in highlighting and exacerbating difference and division through the means of identity. I'll conclude that while social media has not created the evil which motivates individuals to exploit these tools to harm others, it has amplified it to an extremely dangerous extent. We need to develop social and business models to mitigate those harms. We need to educate, but there is an increasingly urgent need, recognised by the multi-billionaire owners of these platforms themselves, to regulate, and to regulate in a far more muscular and assertive manner than we've been inclined to date. But first, where does identity come from? I addressed this conference 4 years ago, and I began with one of my favourite images from New Zealand art, the Colin McCann painting that declared, "I am." It's biblical, it's fundamental, it's primal, this this declaration of self. And then I harked back, sorry for the refresher, last time on the Identity Conference, I harked back to the beginnings of art history when an ancestor's assertion of identity 40,000 years ago on a cave wall, when he or she blew ochre onto the wall using her hand as a stencil to declare her presence to the world, perhaps to signal to others of her clan. A person's identity is a collection of characteristics or traits, sometimes unique to that person, and sometimes expressed in relation to others, to membership of a group. Computer science has even borrowed a term to describe individual bits of data. When I was at school, a person's attributes were their skills and their inherent features. That term is now defined in computing as a piece of information which determines the properties of a field or tag in a database or string of characters in a display. The subjective expression of identity is essential to one's sense of well-being. Denial of that subjective expression is dehumanising and oppressive. Look at what the Chinese government is doing with their internment and re-education camps, which seek to deprive Uyghur people of a defining expression of their identity. What is this desire to control and suppress identity? Fear of difference? How are you threatened by who she says she identifies with? By what attributes constitute her identity? We don't need to go as far as China to see this fear and the intolerance it generates. Last year, the Government Administration Committee, which was considering amendments to the Births, Deaths, Marriages and Relationships Registration Act, recommended to Parliament that applicants to change gender on that most fundamental of identity documents, the birth certificate, should not have to go through a family court procedure and should not have to provide medical evidence of the steps they'd taken to transition. They recommended that the Registrar General should be required to amend a birth certificate based on self-declaration, that is, the self-identification of the individual concerned. This action was recommended many years earlier in a report of the Human Rights Commission, To Be Who I Am, written in large part by Joy Littlecote, who is with us here today and who will be on a panel this afternoon. The proposal that was reported back from the Government Administration Committee would align the process for altering birth certificate with the self-declaration of gender for passports. It's illogical and pointless for different standards to apply. A vocal minority of campaigners, an uneasy alliance of arch-conservatives and a splinter group of feminists, sometimes described as gender-critical theorists, others as trans-exclusionary radical feminists, fomented fear of the consequence of this basic recognition of a human right. And they attacked some of the most vulnerable people in our community and those who support them on the flimsiest of pretexts, including this: the idea of hairy, muscly, sex-starved inmates in women's prisons, and naked, grown male strangers in women's swimming changing rooms. But the thought of men invading women's spaces on the basis of a birth certificate that matches their experience and expression of identity is absurd. When was the last time anyone had to show identity documents to enter a gendered space? And what do these opponents of self-expression think their defence of an archaic status quo will achieve? Imagine the scene. A person arrives at a woman's changing room. The guard is suspicious, because there has to be guards in this world. Asks to see papers. The woman hands over a passport, which confirms the eligible gender. The guard remains suspicious, demands to see the birth certificate as well. The woman flees in tears. Really? This is the world you anticipate, you want? That, for me, is utterly baffling. Why would people feel this need to dictate another's identity? A person's self-identification is something they wear in the world. Whoever they want to be in the world takes nothing from me. A person's allowing someone else to express their identity takes nothing away from anyone else. Who I am does not limit or change who you are or can be. This call for decency and respect for the dignity of the individual, which has been the foundation of Western democracy since at least 1945, arguably far longer, is derided in some quarters as identity politics. Now, this is a misleadingly complex term which incorporates both a lazy slur against progressive politics and an explanation for the rise of the disaffected in support of populist politicians, as well as far-right extremism. It's quite a lot of weight for those two little words to bear. Identity politics is seen by many as the increasing segmentation of the community interested in advocating for and advancing the interests of their particular identity group, whether that be ethnic identity or one based on sexuality, gender, or a range of other subdivisions. Do you think transgender people should be treated with respect and dignity? It's just identity politics. But the loss of a sense of identity actually fuels that dismissiveness and the fear of diversity. Rust Belt communities that voted for Trump, Northern English Brexit voters, supporters of Viktor Orban in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil were worried that their leaders were not respecting their identity, that their social and economic needs are coming second to the needs of others, of refugees, of environmentalists, of elites. Those that seek to deny others their sense of identity through the epithet of identity politics actually fear the erosion of their own sense of identity and their own place in their changing communities. This fear reaches a pathological pitch in its extreme form, which fueled the massacres in Norway, Christchurch, and most recently, El Paso. It's right there in the name. The identitarian movement is a philosophy which incorporates the Great Replacement theory, that not only is some mythical European heritage threatened by societies accommodating a plurality of membership, white cultures and values, whatever those are actively being replaced by non-European peoples, especially Arab and Sub-Saharan Berber peoples. Francis Fukuyama, in his 2018 book, Contemporary Identity Politics and the Struggle for Recognition, argues that identity politics shifts the conversation away from economic policy to identity issues, where essentially your identity is fixed by the ethnicity and the religion and the characteristics of your parents. It feeds polarization and makes democracy vulnerable. The foundation for his argument is an audacious summary of human evolution. In earliest times, you farmed, you lived in villages, you never moved, it never crossed your mind to ask, who am I? You were part of something larger. But we came to perceive in the flowering of philosophical thought a distinction between your true inner self and the outer world of social rules. And along the way, developed into the idea that you could belong to a group with its own shared identity, self-contained, walled off by that belief. Except, not everyone feels that way. Many ordinary people would be more at ease with conforming, finding identity in some larger group with a shared point of view, a shared moral horizon, and be defined by that. But this is where he also sees a way out. Identity, he argues, can be used to divide, but it can also, and has been used to integrate. He sees people finding common cause on the basis of recognising some kind of shared identity about underlying purpose, such as, say, the democratic intent of the republic to which you belong, belief in equality and democratic values, and using that as a basis for peacefully coexisting. He sees the bond that links us across our myriad expressions of racial, ethnic, geographic, national, religious, sexual identity as dignity, and the perception that it has been denied. Whether left or right, your underlying objection is that you have been overlooked and disenfranchised, that your sense of identity feels undermined. I mean, Fukuyama is not a sage, and his opinion is not incontestable. So for balance, one critic noted 3 decades ago, he argued that the human desire for respect and recognition was the driving force behind the universal embrace of liberal democracy. That was the end of history, right? Today, he depicts the human desire for respect and recognition as the driving force behind the repudiation of liberal democracy. Well, we grow and change, I suppose. But regardless of the validity of the wider analysis, in identifying dignity and its deprivation as driving an increasingly exclusive and oppositional expression of identity, he has perhaps identified the crucial inflection point in all this anguish. An attack on dignity is a denial of your essential humanity. We readily recognise an assault on our dignity. We understand that we are all born worthy of being treated as something of value, that we all count, that we all deserve respect, that we all are entitled to autonomy as an individual. And this is a matter in which my office clearly has a role to play. One of the losses that an individual can claim as evidence that an action constitutes an interference with privacy under the Privacy Act is significant loss of dignity. That is, the inherent mana of the person. We have a role to protect and support personal information and, by extension, identity. So, I might ask, do we all have the space, security, and freedom to enable us to develop our identity, to develop who we are without imposition by others? The assignment of identities based on biases is not a phenomenon limited to the digital age. But the loop of identity politics first focus on the demand for equal recognition of marginalised groups, which is then scorned by those who feel their sense of identity is threatened by that, as if equality were a fixed and scarce quantity enjoyed by some only at the expense of others. And then that loop metastasizes into fear, hate, and even murder by the so-called identitarian warriors, determined by warped logic to preserve their threatened sense of self and place in the world. And this is the phenomenon which helps to sustain the identity economy to which I now turn. From a desire to exercise autonomy and self-determination of one's identity, we move to the assignment by others of identity for commercial purposes. In marketing terms, this is known as segmentation. Over the last century, we've seen the science of sales evolve from Henry Ford's "you can have whatever colour you want as long as it's black," to "you have to know your customer in order to meet their needs," to "if you know enough about your customer, you can anticipate their needs," to now, with information they've voluntarily offered up or that we've harvested from them from the wild, you can steer or even dictate their needs and desires. Recently, I was at a meeting in Singapore at which some industry leaders were talking about the application and future of artificial intelligence. AI can take the political and economic trends we've been discussing and turbocharge them. They were discussing algorithmic transparency and the complexity of explaining how a true AI machine might have used a neural network to produce a particular outcome for an individual. Reverse engineering the outcome to try and understand the data on which that outcome was based and the weightings and associations given to those data is an enormous challenge in that technology. For me, the question at least is simple, even if the answer is not. A government or business targeting an individual with services or interventions must be able to answer the question, "Who do you think I am?" What combination of attributes leads you to conclude that I am that person? How have you identified me? What bias connects something in my online behaviour with your putative customer or client? We know that Facebook offers thousands of different market segmentations that advertisers can target. We know that Facebook has displayed an utter and abject moral failure in the responsibilities that come with that multiple assignments of identity. When you can, for commercial gain, allow people to use your algorithms to target a group identified by you as Jew haters, you have relinquished any claim to be a neutral facilitator of connections. Just in case you wondered who I was talking about. We know that Google, on its YouTube platform, nudges viewers along pathways to pedophile tendencies and extremist to more extreme content. These assumptions and assignments of identity are having an increasingly toxic effect on our social and democratic institutions and on our discourse. Here's what one-time Facebook Vice President Chamath Palihapitiya now thinks of the platform. He told an audience, "The short-term, dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. No civil discourse, no cooperation, misinformation, mistruth." He also said of his own children, "They're not allowed to use this shit." What's at stake is how the world sees you. What needs to be addressed is the harm the corporate world, either by intent or through imperfect design, can do in framing and categorising us. Imagine, for example, being booked into a jail and put through a questionnaire that feeds your answer into a program to generate predictions of risk of recidivism. That's what the COMPASS program, which is an acronym standing for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, does. I think you've written about this, Kashmir. It's used by judges, police, and parole officers across the US. The idea is that it will be more objective than humans, just so long as you're the right colour. ProPublica found in a study of 12,000 Florida inmates that black defendants who did not reoffend over a 2-year period were nearly twice as likely to be misclassified as higher risk compared with their white counterparts. White defendants who reoffended within the next 2 years had been mistakenly labelled low risk almost twice as often as black reoffenders. The injustice of that is grave enough, but the further injustice is that with algorithms of this kind, they tend to be black box, proprietary and secret. In other words, not readily challenged. And in fact, the COMPASS algorithm was taken all the way to the state Supreme Court, and the court ruled in favour of the proprietary commercial secrecy of the algorithm against the right of the defendant to see the factors that had weighed the judge's decision. Consider the way algorithmic identity determination governs the search results that you see. There's a website called Image Atlas which demonstrates how the search string you enter will vary depending where on the world you're searching from. If you enter ISIS, you can marvel at the difference in predominance of the images you are presented with, determined by where in the world you enter that word, that phrase. In each, there are about half a dozen images to give a representative picture. If you are in the USA, you will see a large group of soldiers and rubble. In Russia, every image is of soldiers with automatic weapons on their shoulders, arms aloft in triumph. In China, 2 of the images show victims in orange jumpsuits on their knees. In Germany, one of the images is a massacre site and a skull. None show jubilant terrorists. New Zealand has the rubble, the solitary triumphal soldier, the larger group. There is the ISIS banner, there is no skull or jumpsuit. In South Korea, all 6 images are of bottled water. In North Korea, you see the same plastic water bottle images and one of North Korean and American envoys shaking hands. You have no autonomy in this, no agency. There's no visibility. It's decided by your algorithmic identity. Who do you think I am? And thus your personal information on Facebook is turned over to Cambridge Analytica, who uses psychographic techniques and your 5,000 unique data points to manipulate voter behaviour by determining people to whom they assigned an identity of persuadable in key counties of key states in the US and other democracies. So pernicious is that they are identifying people they are expecting to vote for the opposition candidate. They're not trying to change their mind or nudge them to the other side. They're trying to persuade them to stay home. That's how insidious and undermining of democracy this combination of the identity politics and the identity economy has become. In all of this, an identity is imposed on us by someone else, by implication diminishing our own autonomy over our identity. It is, in fact, a corruption of identity. And if we don't have some autonomy over identity, then what have we got left? How should we be responding to this? How do we preserve dignity and autonomy in the face of this digital encroachment? Well, many of you who've heard me speak before know that I always come prepared with a shopping list. I think that all the fine words about social mores, education are important, but we need to start regulating, and we need to do that in, as I said, a more assertive way. Antitrust consumer rights, anti-competitive practices, privacy, electoral integrity. I'd hope to see a more connected global response. If you look at the Christchurch call, for instance, one need that became evident was an industry clearinghouse of some kind for identifying content that we can all agree ought not to be available. The reason these platforms, the 5 that Kashmir managed to avoid just barely for a week, are so dominant is that we simply, they are one and we are many. So they divide us. There is one Facebook and there are 100 privacy commissioners. There is one Facebook and there are 200 electoral commissions. We can't even agree across government how to approach some of these issues, let alone across nations, that the very institutions which have led to the great economic and social prosperity we've enjoyed for the last 80 years are fundamentally under threat. So there needs to be some movement on the international stage and some greater coordination. There needs to be greater consumer advocacy pushback, telling the market to deliver better answers. We're starting to see that. We've got a list of alternative platforms that Kashmir shared with us. The challenge for the corporation must surely be to show respect for the dignity of the individuals for whom their revenue depends. And they need to be prepared to be transparent about that, to allow people greater autonomy over those questions of identity. I should be able to get the answer to questions such as, why am I getting this message? Who do you think I am? Why does my feed look this way? We need greater transparency of algorithms and automated decision-making with counterfactual explanations explaining why it reached a certain decision. I think the idea of personal information portability is important. The right to access your personal information and transfer it to other service providers seamlessly and frictionlessly, notwithstanding objections about fees and the undoing of competitive advantage. And I would refrain a suggestion I've offered before from the book Weapons of Math Destruction, that data scientists, like doctors, should pledge an equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, which concludes, I understand that my work may have enormous effects on society and the economy, many of them beyond my comprehension. And first, I will do no harm. So I'd be looking for a rebalancing in favour of the dignity of the individual. It will require the force of law, but I also have some confidence in the power of moral suasion. I take some heart from the way Cloudflare, for example, recently decided to no longer provide its services to 8chan. I hope we see more of that. And I know that some out there in the free and open internet world believe ISPs acting in the greater good is a significant challenge. Well, we are faced with competing significant challenges. And I am quite comfortable, for example, to have Spark make the decision that you will not be able to access 8chan over its network of tubes. Tim Cook, as we know, CEO of Apple, told an interviewer, we could make a ton of money if we monetized our customer, but we've elected not to do that. Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. This is the quote from the physicist Steve Weinberg. But the ends that matter to most of us, our relationships, our shared experiences, the creation and appreciation of art and literature and so on, don't depend much on us having control over a vast bit, but to us, largely irrelevant universe. Here on this tiny dot of a planet, we all want to be seen, heard, listened to, and treated fairly, to be recognised and understood. Our challenge now is not to become just another tiny dot or data point in the cold, dark universe that's being created online. Thank you.
There's a gift from all of us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Now, what I'd like to do is just invite you to select some questions over here from the audience who are throwing some stuff at you too.
Thank you. Thank you to Anonymous. You've been busy. Why is capturing gender for government documents necessary at all? Excellent question. Any people out here who write these websites, who generate these forms, there is a sort of automatism that we get into. We've always done it, but I think we need to start running a privacy by design framework over some of these concepts and saying, well, what do we need? I provided some feedback to a ski field which had gender as one of the fields it collects. And on Twitter, I tweeted them and said, "Why? I just want to go skiing for a day. Why do you need to know my gender?" And they came back and said, "Well, actually, ski tow fraud is a really big issue. We need to be able to identify who's coming through." And I'm like, "Can you see what I'm wearing? How can you determine what gender I am through my goggles, through my my ski gear?" It is a proxy, and we need to identify proxies and decide what it is that is really important in providing these goods or services. Given how bad Facebook is, then why does the Privacy Commission continue to use Facebook, including Facebook Live? Why not move to an alternative? We use alternatives. It's a legitimate question, and I thank you for it. It's not an easy decision, but the thing is, that's where people are. And if we can be there and say, this is a toxic place run by morally bankrupt pathological liars, then more people are going to hear us. That's just the fact of the matter. Can we turn the heat down in soundings a bit? Do you mean the rhetorical heat or the... Right, thank you for that. You can see what I can see here. Should we call it a close there? Because we've fallen a bit behind and I've allowed us to catch up a bit. Thank you so much for your courtesy.
Thank you, John. It was really insightful to hear you traverse so many different aspects of privacy, right across the things that are right on the pulse of privacy globally and here in Aotearoa. So it was really, really interesting to see that us as a little speck in the universe, but actually some of the challenges that you face in trying to set some standards to keep citizens safe, to enable inside of a democratic society like Aotearoa, how do we protect the interests of individuals and of course the challenges of having to be a barrier or a korowai against corporate interests that may not necessarily have our safety at the front of mind. So thank you, John. I'm certain that's a bit of a very challenging role. So kia ora for your mahi.